My book is about, as was just said a little while ago, the ways in which Muslims have been demonized to suit the goals of empire. But I'm going to take just a small part of this book, which has to do with the narrative that has been dominant, at least for the last 2 centuries in the West, which is the idea that Muslim women are so victimized, are so oppressed, that the West has this burden, this white man's burden, to go off and rescue them. And increasingly the white man's burden has become the white woman's burden, right? And of course, if you actually look at various colonial interventions that have been justified using this language, never has it been the case that brown women, that Muslim women, that Arab women, that Persian women have actually been liberated by empire, right? And yet, this narrative continues to dominate and is still quite dominant in the United States. And so part of what I'm going to argue is I'm going to do a broad sweep of where this narrative comes from, and I'm going to argue that we need to reject this form of imperialist feminism, and we need to instead build grassroots movements from below that is based on the liberation of women right here in solidarity with women all over the world. So let's start with the contemporary moment, which is in the United States. We become familiar with this narrative of victimized brown women who cannot apparently act in any meaningful way in the world, who cannot liberate themselves and so on. And of course that story goes back to the Afghan war in 2001. And this is the image that we got to see again and again and again, which is a Afghan woman in a burqa. If you see her posture, she is isolated, she is scared, she's standing off in the corner, certainly no sense of political agency and ability to act upon the world. When they're together, this is how they are, scared, looking away, not standing in postures that actually indicate any kind of strength. And the question is, where did this narrative come from? It came from the Bush administration, it came from what in media studies we refer to as the prominent primary definers of the news. So I have a few quotes of the people who actually sold this story to us, and they are of the likes of Laura Bush, who, by the way, is fantastically docile, except when it comes to Afghan women, and then she becomes a feminist crusader, right? And then we have, of course, Colin Powell, we also have George Bush, and Sherry Blair, Tony Blair's wife as well, gets in on this story. I'm not going to read all of the quotes to you, I'll just read the top one, and this is from Laura Bush, and she says, "Fighting brutality against women and children is not the expression of a specific culture, it is the acceptance of our common humanity, a commitment shared by people of goodwill on every continent. The fight against terrorism is also a fight for the rights and dignity of women." So there you have it. The war on terror is about the rights of women. It's about the rights and dignity of women around the world. Of course, we know what happens is that I guess they are liberated by bombs falling on their heads, right? Because that's actually what goes on. But the way this argument gets, spun in the mainstream, and here is a cartoon that captures this. What a big threat! Oh my God, you know. We will send your women to college, really? Now, the only way that this can pass as legitimate knowledge in the United States is if you keep hidden what the actual conditions were for Afghan women before the 1980s, before the Soviet Mujahideen war that actually destroyed that country. So let's look at some of these hidden facts. Since the 1950s, girls in Kabul and other cities had in fact attended schools. Half of university students were women. Women made up 40% of Afghanistan's doctors, 70% of its teachers, and 30% of its civil servants. In fact, the attack on women's rights was begun in the late 1980s and early 1990s at the behest of the Mujahideen. These are the holy warriors that the US trains and funds in Pakistan to the tune of billions of dollars. These are the people who then start the attack on women's rights, which is then escalated by the Taliban. Just to give you a sense of, maybe the US didn't know, maybe policymakers didn't know who these people were. They knew very well. Just one person who is a leading figure in the Mujahideen, this guy by the name of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, he comes to prominence. The CIA actually notices this guy because he throws acid on the faces of women who are unveiled. So it was very clear to policymakers in the US who they were allying with, who they were training, and so on. You also know, I'm sure, that Osama bin Laden was, of course, the key CIA asset at this time. He was stored around the Middle East in order to recruit people for the Mujahideen. And so the question we have to ask is, all of a sudden, when some group of people become this prominent in the mainstream media, and it's not to say that women did not suffer under the Taliban, of course they did, but when suddenly there is this kind of attention, we have to ask, what is the agenda that's actually behind it? And I actually did a study of the amount of media attention prior to 9/11 and after 9/11. Here's what we found. In the full year of 1999, there were a grand total of 37 broadcast media stories about the plight of Afghan women. Then between January and September 11th of 2001, 33 stories. Wow, right? We're so concerned about the suffering of these women. And then just a 4-month period from September 1 to January 1, September 1, 2001 to January 1, 2002, 628 stories, right? So immediately you know, when there is this much attention being focused on a set of victims, what Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman would call worthy victims, there is a larger political agenda that is at work. And of course, the US's agenda in a nutshell is partly revenge, go in and get Osama bin Laden, but it's also about geostrategic interest, it's about China, it's about setting up bases in Afghanistan in order to be players in relation to the Caspian Sea oil and natural gas reserves. But you can't tell Americans to send off their brothers, their sisters, their fathers, their mothers to go fight for oil and to go fight for these sorts of reasons, and therefore these sorts of narratives get peddled. I'm going to skip this next slide, or maybe I'll go through it very quickly, but the fact of the matter is that Afghan women were not these victims waiting to be rescued by others. In fact, there's a group called RAWA, which is established in 1977, that has been active in the fight for women's rights. And they actually wrote quite eloquently, don't come and rescue us, we're perfectly capable of rescuing ourselves, but of course the US wouldn't take yes for an answer. And so these are some sort of statistics of, what women, facts, of what women were involved in. They were they actually helped to write Afghanistan's constitution, won rights like universal suffrage, equal pay. I think what's significant is that most women, in fact, did not wear the burqa, which is the full body veil. Many devout women actually only wore headscarves and long dresses, but not the full burqa. And so this is how imperialist feminism works. It works to erase, first of all, the actual history of women in these countries, and second, their own self-activity. And the person who, by the way, was denied a visa when she wanted to come for a tour to promote her book, Malalai Joya, has written really well about how the US NATO intervention has, in fact, not liberated women in that country. When she did come a few years ago, I had the privilege of interviewing her and hosting her at one of her stops in New York City. And I'm just going to quote from that interview what she says about what's happened to Afghan women since the US NATO intervention. And here's how she put it. She said, first, let me say that after September 11th, the US government threw us from the frying pan into the fire. The US, under the banner of women's rights and human rights, has occupied my country, and millions of men and women have suffered from injustice, insecurity, corruption, joblessness, poverty, etc. So both men and women have suffered as a result of the occupation. But she goes on to say, women have suffered more. For them, it is almost as if the Taliban was still in power. After the war, the US brought to power these misogynistic warlords called the Northern Alliance, who are just like the Taliban. They were the same people who ruled between 1992 and 96, and they attacked women's rights and human rights. And so it's not surprising, therefore, that women's rights have deteriorated under the Northern Alliance. In fact, recently, these people who formed the Karzai government passed a law that made it legal. Marital rape is now legal, right? So women have no recourse against this form of sexual violence. And make no mistake about it, my interview with Joya was, I think, from 5 years ago, so I decided I would bring a more recent human rights report, and this was published by the University of Notre Dame. And Courtright and Wall, the authors of the study, say that 87.2% of women have been subject to violence, including, and I'm quoting them now, forced marriage, honor crimes, rape, and sexual and physical abuse. It is estimated that 81% of all women in Afghanistan will experience domestic violence at some point in their lives. And so at the end of the day, even though there have been some gains made in relation to education, in relation to healthcare, the situation overall is quite dire for the vast majority of Afghan women. And yet this is not the story that we're told again and again in the mainstream news media in this country. This is a cover from Time magazine in 2010. And it tells a very clear story. This is what is going to happen to Afghan women if the United States, if NATO actually leaves that country. And by the way, this woman, her name is Bibi Aisha, and there's actually some controversy about whether the Taliban are responsible for, cutting off her nose. But that wasn't part of the story, and I don't have the time to go into it. But you can see how she becomes the poster child, the poster woman for this kind of narrative. And just last year, in May, Amnesty USA took out this campaign where they had these huge ads and these billboards and so on with images of Afghan women wearing burqas and a caption that read, "Human rights for women in Afghanistan, NATO, keep the progress going," right? So NATO, don't get out of there, keep the progress going, and this is Amnesty International, right? So it should cause us to really ask the question, why it is that fully 12 years after the US intervention into Afghanistan, and despite books by people like Malalai Joya and several others who have completely debunked the notion that the US and NATO are liberating women, why is it that this story is the one that we keep hearing again and again? And Sadia Tour has this excellent piece, it's called Imperialist Feminism Redux, in which she argues that basically the argument now has become far more sophisticated. It has gone from its neoconservative form back in 2001 into a much more liberal form these days, a much more sophisticated form these days. And in a nutshell, what's taken place is this. Back in 2001, the people making these arguments were the neocons. People know who the neocons are, right? They are the folks who were in charge during the Bush administration's regime. And the women, the black and brown women who came forward to justify this narrative that women in Muslim majority countries need to be rescued were out and out conservatives, right? They were people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, if you've heard of her, she's an opportunist. She comes here from the Netherlands and she takes up a position at the Conservative American Enterprise Institute. So it's easy to debunk these people as opportunists and tied into the neoconservatives and so on. But what Sadia talks about in her piece is now you actually have an organization called the Center for Secular Space, which has real feminists in it. South Asian feminists, North African feminists, US feminists, people who have some real credentials in their local context fighting for women's rights. And that's what has given greater legitimacy to this argument. And in essence, what they've argued is that all of these studies that have been done, which have showed, how horrible US imperialism has been, whether it is the impact of drone strikes in Pakistan and Afghanistan, what torture has done, or what the extraordinary rendition program has done, and so on. What they do is they criticize people for doing that, saying, you need to get over your liberal guilt, stop focusing on Muslim men, because Muslim men are still very much the problem. So it's a sort of feminist argument that's being marshaled and pushing back against supposedly liberal guilt. And here's how they put it. They say, you should reject the liberal guilt is misplaced in its focus on Muslim men, and this constitutes a betrayal of Muslim women as well as human rights advocates in Muslim majority countries. And so that's in a nutshell how this argument has progressed. It's now coming from much more liberal quarters. And so we have two versions of this argument today. We have the conservative imperialist feminist argument, and then we have the more liberal imperialist feminist argument. But increasingly, both of them are starting to look similar. And so I'm going to show you an example of the conservative imperialist argument. This is from a documentary called The Third Jihad. It is made by a coalition of far right-wing people in this country, and this was the film that was shown on a continuous loop to NYPD recruits as part of their training. This is the best part, if I can say that. because the rest of it is awful, but take a look and then we can talk about it.
Not many people are aware of the fact that in Iran you'll find the so-called modesty police patrolling the streets.
گلم وانتود هم تنگه هم خیلی چکش بازه بله دیگه فقط موهاتون الان بیرون نشارتون رو زحمت بکشین درست کنین توی کشور اسلامی زندگی میکنیم درسته موهاتون هم الان کاملا پیداست آرایشتون هم تنده هم شلوارتون هم که کوتاهه شما بابا تشریف میارید داخل اتوبوس
If women are caught wearing the wrong clothing, they could be fined or even arrested.
To women entering this shop in Tehran, a message saying all clothes sold here have been approved by the police. The length and size of coats, nothing too short, nothing too tight, and mostly in black. Women who shop here know there's no risk of getting a warning or being arrested for indecency.
من هؤلاء الذين يقررون لي ماذا يجب أن أكون عليه؟ لماذا تعاملوني كسيدة أنني ناقصة الأهلية وهنالك دائما صوت ذكوريا يقرر لي ما يجب أن أكون عليه؟
As a woman, if you, and all individuals are different, but if you are an individual woman with a strong character and you rebel against this kind of life, you run more than anyone else the risk of being beaten. Abused, your spirit being killed by your own family, by your own loved ones.
ولا بد أن نعلم أن الضرب عقوبة شرعية لا يملك إنسان أن ينكره لأن الذي شرعها هو الذي خلق هذا الإنسان.
هو لا شك أن الضرب هو يعتبر وسيلة من وسائل الإصلاح.
قال لي أنا ماني جاي أضربك أنا جاي أقتلك ومسك في رقبتي وسدحني على الأرض وبدأ يخنق فيها بنظرات يعني.
But the issue of men controlling women's lives goes much deeper. It can even result in murder.
Just another teenager with everything to live for, except that Heshu Yonez was trapped between two cultures. When she began a relationship with a Christian Lebanese boy, her strict Kurdish Muslim father slit her throat.
Chowdhury Rashid is charged with first-degree murder in the death over the weekend of his 25-year-old daughter, Sandila Kanwal. Based on what police say, this could be what's known as an honor killing, the murder of a woman, often by a family member, to punish her for shaming the family.
According to the United Nations, some 5,000 women and girls are victims of so-called honor killings every year. Whether it's because they've been seen talking to a man, refusing an arranged marriage, or even suffering rape, they're murdered for one reason only. They're perceived to have brought shame on their family. And it's often the family that carries out the sentence.
This is Aksa Parvez. Her father told authorities that he strangled her, allegedly, because she wouldn't wear a headscarf.
We are bound by the rules. If a woman runs away, she must be killed.
Good name is more important than the penalty. We don't care about the penalty. A good name is the most important thing in our world.
Islam does not countenance honor killing, but has nevertheless become part of Islam as practiced in much of the Islamic world.
Okay, if you like that, you can watch the rest of it on your own. So essentially what you see in this video is a very one-sided kind of depiction of what, it's not to say that, you know, honor killings don't happen. It's not to say that there isn't a morality police in Iran, and it's not to say that women in Muslim majority countries don't face oppression and sexism and so forth. That is true. But what you see here is a filming technique that is entirely based on othering, right? It is these barbaric, demonic brown men who are terrorizing these women, and therefore incites in us that response that we have a responsibility to go off and rescue them and so forth. Now, you could tell really the same sort of story about the United States as well if you wanted to. If I was a filmmaker, I could make a film that is about 5 minutes long with the following content, and all of what I'm going to say is true. In the US, every 6.2 minutes a rape is reported. 1 in 5 women will be raped in their lifetime, and if you go to college, your chances are higher. It's 1 in 4 women who will be raped. In Steubenville recently, at a high school there, the football team actually formed what they called a rape crew, where they routinely go around raping young women, young teenage women. And most recently, there was a leak by the group Anonymous. If you haven't seen that video, you should watch it. It is these young men bragging about what they've done, tweeting about what they've done while this is going on, with this comatose woman being dragged by her ankles from one room to the next, being gang raped again and again and again. And one of them is saying, she is so raped, she is dead, right? I'm paraphrasing him. So let's start with that clip. Then we can go on to the 16-year-old who was gang raped right here in Richmond, California, barely in November. And the month before that, a 15-year-old in New Orleans, again gang raped brutally. April, 6 men gang raped a 14-year-old in Chicago. And you know, if we want to get away from the theme of young girls, teenage girls getting raped, and going to the other end of it, in Central Park in Manhattan, a 73-year-old woman was brutally beaten and raped. And most recently, and that was back in September. So all these stats I'm giving you are just over the last 6-8 months. And I'll end with this one, which is a New York City police officer was actually arrested back in October because he had laid out very serious plans to kidnap, rape, hook, and eat a woman. Any woman, doesn't matter, this was the plan that he actually laid out. So imagine if I made a film like that about the United States, how men in this country would actually look. They wouldn't come off looking particularly good. And so that's what is being employed in this particular video. It's this process of othering and of presenting brown men in particular as these evil, barbaric people that we need to vanquish in order to rescue brown women. And of course, you know, this narrative completely, as I said earlier, erases the actual agency, the political agency of women themselves. Here is a picture from Pakistan, women organizing and fighting back against rape laws in that country. This is Asma Jahangir, a human rights lawyer in Pakistan, part of these movements for justice for women. And this is Shirin Ebadi, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, a lawyer, human rights activist, women's rights activist from Iran. And of course, none of these people ever make it into these sorts of films, right? So the idea is not that we cannot tell the stories of what happens to women everywhere around the world. The key is what kind of solution do we prescribe, and how do we then look at people who are different from us in other parts of the world. Now, if this is the modern imperialist feminist argument, this has, as I said at the start of my talk, a much longer history. It goes back at least to the 19th century, and this was, as you know, the heyday of European colonialism. And colonialism needed a narrative, it needed a justification in order to exist. That is to say, particularly after the French Revolution, right, when you have things like equality, fraternity, democracy, all of these ideas being accepted as universal ideas, how do you justify going off and colonizing an entire people, stealing their resources, and so forth? So you need an ideology that is racist in order to justify this process. And this doesn't happen by accident. It is actually quite systematic. At the turn of the 19th century, in the late 18th and early 19th century, France and Britain and Belgium and so on set up these Oriental schools where scholars come to produce this kind of knowledge that ultimately will pave the way for the colonial enterprise. And in the book, I actually talk about the first moment of enlightened colonialism, and that was Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. And what was different about this invasion from, say, previous colonial conquests is that Napoleon was extraordinarily well prepared, right? This is a guy who had read everything you could read about Egypt, including the Quran. And when he goes there, he impresses the scholars at Al-Azhar University by citing the Quran, by explaining things from the Quran and so on. And so it's the first moment when knowledge is used systematically as a way to rule, right? And I won't go into that anymore. It's explained in much more depth in the book. But as part of this argument, as part of this Orientalist argument, right? This is the ideology. Orientalism is the ideology. Comes this notion of the white man's burden, which is to rescue both the women as well as the men in these countries. There's a poem by Rudyard Kipling called The White Man's Burden. That's where the term comes from. And he refers to the colonized as half devil, half child. And half devil, of course, is the idea that these people are so strange and so demonic that we should vanquish them, we should torture them, we should use whatever form of torture and control that we need to. But on the other hand, they're also childlike. And so we need to civilize them, we need to bring them up to our level, right? And if that was the story back in the 19th century, today I think we can paraphrase in the era of the war on terror, we now have half terrorist, half victim. And that's a gendered story, right? Where the men are terrorists and the women are victims. So what I'm going to do actually is, instead of going through how this story gets told, I'm going to go through a history of oil paintings in the 19th century to tell you how this whole notion is sold. And by the way, as a quick precursor, the story about Muslim women was basically one that, as one scholar put it, there is no subject connected with Islam which Europeans have thought more important than the condition of Muslim women. So this obsession with rescuing Muslim women starts in the 19th century, and the dominant narrative was that Muslim women were severely subjugated, oppressed. In fact, they were little more than slaves, and you're going to see some images of slaves. And just as Muslim despots tyrannized their subjects, they also tyrannized their wives and daughters. But the reality, of course, was much more complex than that, right? Because, first of all, the people writing this story were white men who would not have had access to Muslim women. They would not have been able to meet them, interview them, ask them what they actually thought, right? No anthropological study of any kind was actually done. This was more what was in their own minds that was being put down on paper. That said, European women, that is the wives of colonial administrators, who traveled to Egypt, to Iran, and so on and so forth, wrote a much different story than the one told by their husbands and by the colonial overlords and so on. It's a much more complex story, as you might imagine, right? But that's not the story, largely speaking, that gets used in the service of the colonial enterprise. So, 1798, this is the moment of Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. One of the first things that happens is that he orders the killing, the poisoning of 50 incurable plague victims in Jaffa. And that news gets out, and goodness, how can you possibly tout the white man's burden if you're going around killing people, right? Now, in today's world, with the PR industry, we would call this damage control, the need to do damage control, and a video would be made. But back in the day, paintings were commissioned, and so this was the painting that came out of that. And the painting is called Napoleon at a Playhouse in Jaffa. It takes about 5 years. Sadly, it's not as quick as video today. And what you see is Napoleon in the center. I don't know if you can see him clearly, but there he is, not poisoning or ordering that these people who have plague be killed, but touching a plague victim, right? Sort of simulating the healing touch of God or the healing touch of kings. And there you have it. This is the white man come in to save and rescue the colonized. Now, at the same time that this is happening, Napoleon's wife orders and commissions another painting to be done. And this is La Grande Odalisque. It is one of the first few images of the harem that we see during this period. And it really embodies everything that this narrative of that we're going to hear is all about. First of all, we know she's not European, even though she is very white, because of the the drapery. It's silk with rich embroidery. We see this table in the background. We see her fan with peacock feathers and so forth. And this is a standard pose actually for a nude in paintings around this time. As John Berger put it in a book called Ways of Seeing, women were presented as these passive objects, right? Reclining, not actually active in the world and so on. That was true of European women. It's also true of this woman. But because she's looking back at the viewer, she is inviting them to possess her, right? And the way that people have read this particular image is to say that possessing the woman then comes to stand in for possessing the land, right? And so the land itself becomes feminized, the land becomes a territory that you can possess, and you know what? The women actually are inviting it. And here is Delacroix's, and Delacroix, by the way, is a fantastic painter, amazingly talented painter. This is his Women of Algiers. If you look at it again, you have these Muslim women, passive, languid, lacking in agency, simply sort of sitting around, waiting for their men to come back, right? They've got nothing meaningful to actually do in the world. The only person who has any agency, who's moving around, is the black slave. And she keeps coming back again and again. Here is Jerome, another amazing painter. It is one of his paintings is called Pool in a Harem. What's interesting about this painting is not just the image of the black slave, but also that the woman who's lying there could just as easily be European as she could be Turkish or Iranian or Algerian, right? And so part of the work that's going on here is the projection of a European repressed sort of imagination onto the fantasy world that they think and that they hope that they can realize in the Orient, right? So it's all very much a fantasy. Now, what happens when brown men enter the image with brown women? This is Delacroix again. And immediately you see the violence. The first thing that stands out is this turbaned man about to kill this woman, right? And if you take it in, and I'll give you 1 second to take it in, you come away with at least a couple of ideas. This painting, by the way, is based on Lord Byron's novel, play. It's called The Death of Sardanapalus, and it's the story of an Assyrian king, Sardanapalus. Okay, so there are three things that sort of stand out in this play. There's a lot, this painting. One, the idea of an orgy, these sort of sexual excesses of these kind of people. That too is a form of othering. That actually, that narrative begins in the 11th century with the Crusades. I don't have the time to get into it, but these people are just so unable to control themselves, particularly the men. So you see the king there, and he doesn't seem to care that all of this death and barbarism is happening around him, right? And so if you were a viewer in the 19th century, you would see this, and in part there would be titillation as to what you're watching, but at the same time you come away with a sense of, oh my God, I'm so repulsed by this, our people would never do this, and so a sense of superiority in our culture. And the question, of course, is why are Muslim men, why are brown men this way? Delacroix has an answer. This painting really is called Fanatics of Tangier, and all you need to know is the green flag of Islam in the middle, and this is what makes them the way they actually are. And it's not simply that they're fanatics and they kill their women and they torture their women, they also turn them into slaves. Again, Jerome, amazing painter. This is the slave market. Right? And again, you can see a sense in which there's both a sort of projection of fantasy, but there is also a sense of repulsion. We don't do this in the West. We are superior. So it shouldn't come as a surprise then that almost a century later, when the British occupy Egypt, they are using this narrative. And so Lord Cromer, who oversaw the occupation in Egypt, talked about Islam in the following way. He said, Islam as a social system has been a complete failure. The degradation of women in the East is a canker that begins its destructive work early in childhood and is eaten into the whole system of Islam. The solution is therefore that Muslims be persuaded or forced into imbibing the true spirit of Western civilization. Now the question is, did Lord Cromer actually do anything for Egyptian women? Of course not. If anything, he took back some of the rights that they'd won, including educational rights. And why should that be a surprise? If you dig a little into who this man actually was, he was a founding member and president of the Men's League to End Women's Suffrage back home in Britain, right? And so here you have it, imperial feminism. It's the deployment of feminist ideas to justify imperialism. I'm going to show a few more images and abuse my out-of-state invitation here because I don't live here. I'm hoping you'll let me show a few more images. Okay, so this is the story in the 19th century in paintings, but of course the same narrative is heard in novels. The same narrative can be found in film, that is film at the early 20th century. So I want to show a few examples from that. And what happens in the early 20th century is that white women now become the subject of rescue, right? White women need to be rescued from these hypersexualized, lusty Arabs, right? And this is actually a new twist on an old tale. In fact, this idea, the rescue narrative of white women needing to be rescued goes all the way back to the Native Americans, where genocide was justified because Native American men were allegedly kidnapping and couldn't wait to kidnap and rape white women. And we see the same story with African Americans, right? Black men as these out of control sexual predators, right? And that's how rape laws, in fact, were constructed all the way up until the feminist movement of the 1960s. There's a film called Birth of a Nation. I don't know if you've seen it, but there's one scene in particular, which is a rape scene, where this black man, actually, it's a white actor in blackface who is chasing this white woman, and she runs up a hill, and I won't tell you what happens after she runs up the hill, because I want you to keep that in mind as I show you the scene from The Sheikh. This is Rudolph Valentino in the 1921 film, The Sheikh. There you have it. Whereas in Birth of a Nation, she runs to the top of the hill and hurls herself to her death. And then, of course, the protagonists of that film, the Ku Klux Klan, can then come in and ride to the rescue of other women and this fate befalling them. when white women are placed in these exotic oriental settings, they suddenly become feminists in a way that they aren't back in their own time, in their own place. Now you may have noticed that while Rudolph Valentino's character is presented as somewhat odd and lusty and all the rest of it, he's not presented as badly as the African American characters in Birth of a Nation, because she actually falls in love with him, and eventually it's revealed, phew, he's actually a European pretending to be a Jew. So thank God there's no mixed race relationship. But what you'll see is that in the 1970s onwards in Hollywood, particularly after the oil crisis, you see a whole slew of films actually presenting Arabs and sheikhs as being these vulgar, rich people who are not only buying up the United States, but buying women, right? And so we need to rescue our women from them. And there is absolutely, this sort of that depiction gets even worse, if you will. And so in 2011, right, 10 years after the US invasion of Afghanistan, and also at the birth of the Arab Spring, what's called the Arab Spring, which I prefer to call the Arab uprisings, we're still seeing imperialist feminism in the form of this show Homeland, which I will show you just a small clip of.
Raised in Colorado Springs, attended BYU. Interests, finance, travel, men. Stacey Moore, this is Latif bin Walid, Major Domo for His Highness Prince Farid.
Please continue.
Would you say you're outgoing or more the quiet type, Stacey?
I'd say more outgoing. Definitely social. I like to party, if that's what you mean.
Do you drink?
I'm not a drinker, per se, if that's what you mean.
Stacey, you are interviewing for a job that pays in 2 years more than most people in this country earn in 20. If you're successful in this interview, you will be required to appear self-possessed, confident, modest, and reticent all at the same time. So stop asking what I mean. Think and answer for yourself. Do you enjoy anal sex?
Here we have again the rich Arab buying American women. Of course, now it takes education. It also takes white women doing these interviews. And eventually the protagonist of this show is a white woman who will try to go and rescue this woman. And the reason I showed this many clips is because even among progressives, even among people who see themselves as being part of the left, this idea is so entrenched that it becomes very difficult to shake people out of the notion that this is actually an imperial narrative. This is not a narrative that is about liberating women in Muslim-majority countries, because we're watching this show at the same time that this is going on, right? Women are in the streets protesting, fighting back against entrenched dictators. This is in Egypt, right? Here is a woman in a full burqa, the prototypical image of the victim, and here she is with a sign that says "Down with Mubarak." Women and men both battling cops in the streets, both being beaten, both throwing stones, fighting back. Even Saudi Arabia, Tunisia. And yet this is not the story that we get, right? This is not the story that captures our imagination. So I'm going to come to the last part of my presentation by arguing that to show these images, I'm not saying again that the struggle for women's rights is somehow over in Tunisia, in Saudi Arabia, or in Egypt. It is very much a struggle that continues, but the key to keep in mind is that women in these countries have been fighting these battles at least for the last century. The struggle for women's rights didn't begin in the 21st century. In fact, it goes all the way back to the turn of the 20th century. It's in the context of the national liberation struggles that erupt in all of these countries that what's called the women's question comes to the fore, right? And you see women in country after country actually talking about the right for women to exist in the public sphere, to be educated, to hold jobs in the public sphere, and so on and so forth. So for instance, in Egypt, you see that the women involved in the national liberation struggle are in fact far more, uncompromising and steadfast than their male counterparts. Leila Abu Lughod has written really well about the part that women have played in the Egyptian struggle for national liberation. And they were less compromising, she says. They were much more steadfast than their male counterparts. There's a great book called Remaking Women by Leila Abu Lughod, in which there are essays about the part played by women at the turn of the 20th century in Iran, in Egypt, and so on. And what they do is they look at some of the writings of women in the turn of the century women's press and the role that these women actually played in theorizing the women's question. And of course, what actually became of women and their rights in different countries depends on so many factors, right? When someone says, what is the status of Muslim women in Muslim majority countries? There is no single answer to that. Not only because Islam looks different in each of these countries, but also it depends on region. It depends on city versus rural areas. It depends on class. It depends on ethnicity. It depends on whether you're a religious or ethnic minority, and so on and so forth. There is no simple, straightforward answer to these questions. And this book really looks at that very well. It looks at the nature of the different political projects that were involved in the national liberation struggle, how much Islam was used in mobilizing these national liberation projects, what was the relationship to the colonial powers, was this direct colonialism, was this indirect colonialism, what role did women actually play, what was the struggle over the interpretation of Islamic law, what kind of post-colonial state was set up, and so on and so forth. In short, there is no simple answer, but what we do know is that this question was fought for by women all over this region that we call the quote-unquote Muslim world. That said, it was really contradictory, this struggle, because on the one hand, while they were arguing for women's participation outside the home, there was also this huge thrust to give women responsibility for the scientific management of the home in order to raise children who can be future citizens of a modern nation, right? So this bourgeois notion of the family actually gets championed, the nuclear family and so on, which doesn't actually help a lot of women in Muslim majority countries who've lived in extended families, because they could marshal the resources of other women who lived in their household to fight back against the men and so forth. So it's a very contradictory and complex story, which in many ways looks like the story in this country, right? There are steps forward, there are steps backwards, which is why we tell the story of waves of feminism, the first wave, the second wave, the third wave, and so forth. And so I'll come to an end with this, and that is that we have to reject this idea of imperialist feminism. But the question is, what do we put in its place? Right? In its place, we cannot reject the white man's burden and put in its place the white woman's burden. And so let me read you the response by some Indian feminists who wrote a letter to their counterparts at Harvard University. A task force was set up by Harvard to give India advice on how to handle the rape situation in the Indian context. And these women say, I'm just going to read you small excerpts from this letter. It says, not since the days of Catherine Mayo have American women and American feminists felt such a concern for their less privileged third world sisters. Mayo's concern at that time was to ensure that the Indian state, then the colonial state, did not leave Indian women in the lurch at the mercy of their men, and that it retained power and the rule of the just. And then it goes on to say, you are trying to formulate certain recommendations for the Indian government. Here is a bunch of stuff that we've already done. We who are feminists, who are lawyers, who are activists, who've been doing this work for the last several decades, it might be useful to you. And it says, this is clearly something that we Indian feminists who have been involved in the women's movement here for several decades are incapable of doing, and it was with a sense of overwhelming relief that we read your intention to step into this breach. And it goes on to say, the work that we've done may be useful in your efforts. One of the greatest things about sisterhood is that it is so global. Feminism has built such strong international connections, such that whenever our first world sisters see that we are incapable of dealing with problems in our countries, they immediately step in to help us out and provide us with much needed guidance and support. We are truly grateful for this. Perhaps you will allow us to repay the favor, and the next time President Obama wants to place legislation to do away with abortions or with the Equal Rights Amendment, we can step in and help, and from our own small bit of experience in these fields, recommend what the United States can do. And so I think we have to take the spirit of what is said here, which is the idea that we cannot have this top-down sort of approach. We need a grassroots movement with a recognition that sexual violence or just oppression of women, misogyny, is a global problem. Women face it right here in this country, as they do in Pakistan, as they do in India, as they do in Egypt and elsewhere. And so the solution is not to look at our governments, whether we live in India or Egypt or the United States, but to look to one another, men and women, and build this kind of grassroots movement of solidarity between one another. Thank you very much.